Hello, my name's Brian Gorst and I'm an art tutor at Malvern School of Art in Great Malvern. This talk is a personal response to the work of Dame Laura Knight and sets out the reasons why I think she's one of the most inspiring and important British artists of the 20th century. I'm going to look at her work quite specifically from my own point of view as a practicing painter and teacher. I'm going to explore 6 qualities that I admire in her practice, picking out some key examples alongside occasional works from other artists. Before I start, I think it would help to show some examples of my own work. I've painted in a number of styles and genres over the years, figurative work such as portraiture and allegorical painting. I've painted numerous landscapes and quite a lot of traditional still lifes. I've also broadened out into abstract painting and more recently into a series of small-scale assemblages of a more conceptual nature. Because I've got this explorative tendency in my own work, I think it's one of the reasons why I'm so drawn to the incredible variety found throughout Laura Knight's entire body of work. I studied at the Graduate School of Figurative Art in New York, which was a very academic training consisting of cast drawing, life drawing, painting, composition, perspective, anatomy, etc. Similar to the kind of study that the young Laura Johnson would have undertaken at Nottingham School of Art, albeit without the life drawing that female students at the time were excluded from. She even writes about having to draw this very same discobolus statue that I drew when all the young men were drawing from the life model. I came to Dame Laura Knight's work quite late, really. I knew of some of the larger pieces and the famous war paintings, but only in relation to other artists like Stanley Spencer and Graham Sutherland. But more recently as a tutor, I've tried to seek out more examples of women artists such as Laura Knight to inspire the students. But it was the exhibition in the open air in 2012 in Worcester that was a real eye-opener for me. When I saw those pictures in the gallery, it cemented my appreciation for her skill, her confidence and exuberance, and the breadth of her visual language. One of the first things that struck me at the Worcester exhibition was the diversity of painting styles and methods that she deploys. Sometimes her works seem to be pulling in contrasting aesthetic directions, and I don't think it's that easy to pin down a single Laura Knight style. Her work can be atmospheric and impressionistic, very much influenced by the French tradition and its inheritors and adapters in Glasgow and Breton. But her paintings are also often fully rendered and naturalistic, far more in a 19th century academic tradition. Many of her pictures were created with a look and put or alla prima approach that was very much inspired and encouraged by her friend Alfred Munnings during the Cornish period. This portrait of Dolly Snell, famously painted in pretty much a single day, displays the bravura and swagger of Manet's standing portraits, which were themselves inspired by portraits by Velázquez. But equally, some of her finest works are the result of highly structured preparative processes, such as underdrawing and extensive studies, as in this incredibly complex wartime commission of bombers being constructed. She painted this as a large watercolour because of the dangers of painting in oil inside the factory. And this also highlights her ability to switch between a number of painting and printmaking techniques. For me, this flexibility reflects a desire to serve each subject itself rather than any particular style, to respond to people and places that surround her throughout her life in the most appropriate way to them. And I don't think this is always the case with many artists of the 20th century. One of the unspoken requirements of the successful modernist artist is to forge a singular and consistent language, a sort of brand. This should be new and innovative, and you should stick with it, apply it to whatever subject you're concerned with, and create a cohesive and original body of work. I think artists still talk in these terms today, and are often led by galleries who are looking for a consistent, marketable style. I think Laura Knight inherited a more 19th century attitude to picture making, based around singular showpiece pictures and conversation pieces that have to work on their own terms. She talks a lot about working on this picture or that picture rather than a series of works. She and her husband Harold both aspired for many years to be accepted into and make an impact at the Royal Academy. Her large-scale portrait of the artist Lamorna Birch was reworked over a long period before being exhibited at the RA in 1934. I think the final painting is brilliantly informal and jaunty with the way that Lamorna is holding his daughter, and it shows that whilst she wanted a recognition of the Academy, she wanted it on her own terms. She almost has more of an illustrator's approach to her art, I think, just as in these pictures of the Air Force crew and the Women's Auxiliary Air Force personnel. These are characters and stories to be clearly communicated to a viewer, and I think Laura Knight had the understanding, the skill and the humility to modify her style and methods to bring out the best in each subject. When the young 13-year-old Laura Johnson studied at Nottingham School of Art, she was taught a comprehensive approach to drawing through both observation and design. Although she resented having to draw plaster casts rather than the nude model simply because she was female, I think this discipline must have given her a fuller appreciation of how light reveals forms in predictable ways, and this awareness of sculptural form is an ever-present in her work. She took over her mother's teaching duties at the age of 15, and having to teach art to others must have instilled an objectivity and a rationality about the creative process itself. She would apparently draw on whatever was to hand, and Munnings said she had the energy of 6. Her drawings are a kind of shorthand, often a form of rapid information gathering. There's little self-consciousness in the sketches, and they're rarely rendered to a finish or overworked just for effect. Errors are left to sit alongside corrections, and she obviously understood their lasting artistic value because most of her sketches from her entire life's work remained close at hand in her studio. Her drawing practice allowed her to rehearse forms and compositions before embarking on final pictures, particularly with complex subjects such as figures and animals. Also to test out lighting effects, and maybe even to rework existing compositions. I think she understood that good drawing practice actually frees up the painting process to enable it to be more expressive and more spontaneous. She often seems to lean into the limitations of each drawing media, realising that sometimes the tools we use resist us, and that can actually help us find new and unexpected ways of working. Her drawing style evolved throughout her life, and she consciously developed different languages according to the subject and the application at hand. When she was recording the movement of dancers, she realised it required much more abbreviated mark making. She was attempting to capture the essence of the movements, and she recounts scrawling haphazardly on a piece of paper. This is an example of a more modernist sensibility pushing itself by necessity through to a fairly traditionalist artist. I think the same thing happened with Rodin, with his drawings also of dancers. Dame Laura Knight's approach to composition for me hits a number of points of excellence. She seems to have a natural ability to know when and how to manipulate the rhythms of a picture. First of all, how to select and frame a scene most effectively, then to move the eye around the picture along sweeping curves, as in this picture, or bold diagonals, as in this brilliant watercolour of a clay pit from 1914. Here she draws the eye from the bottom right across to the other corner and then back round again, and then we're pushed back into the centre until we're halted by the only vertical in the picture. Here again in this London watercolour, she contrasts the movement of the road, the dynamics within the picture, with the landing point that is the pillar box, creating a moment of focus and rest right in the middle of the picture. She also likes to pull the viewer in and out of the composition. In this Flying a Kite picture, we're drawn forward, pulled forwards with the children, rushing forward with the Newlyn below and Penzance in the distance. But then the warm red jacketed child kind of pulls our attention back again. In this picture, there's a similar dynamic as we follow the foreground figure down into the water. We we move across to the far figure, and then we're drawn back again by a red element on the hat of the foreground figure. She's not averse to using almost cinematic devices such as mirrors to add complexity to an interior composition. And in this picture, the group of dancing figures, whilst being stylised, are layered and closely compacted, which adds to the believability and the immediacy. She seems to relish the loading up of active elements of a composition into complex and challenging arrangements, both for her and for the viewer. I think this was probably what drew Laura Knight to wartime subjects and circuses and backstage scenes. Highly visual arenas that are often just on the verge of chaos. In contrast, though, she's not afraid of using empty spaces effectively, allowing large portions of the composition to just sit there and augment the main subject. Here, the area of detail and interest, the cast, the troupe of dancers is narrowly confined within a small area between two areas of relatively unoccupied space of the stage front and the curtain. And in a way, that crampedness kind of reflects the reality for the dancers and performers backstage in a performance. Here in this quite famous painting, The Balloon Sight in Coventry, it's the vastness of the balloon escaping off the top of the picture that pulls the viewer upwards. I think it actually took my breath away when I saw this picture in the Worcester exhibition. And what's so clever is to also then, once you've achieved that sort of gravitas, to switch the scale so that the narrative of the picture still remains about the effort of the women volunteers rather than the balloon itself. In this painting, which is almost a companion picture, In for Repairs, it has almost the opposite rhythm. It draws the eye downwards, and it's so bold the way she's dedicated so much of the picture to the cloth, the ripples, the reflections on the metallic surface. I think Lucian Freud plays a similar game in this picture, which was painted quite a few decades later. Now, on her first visit to America, Laura Knight comments on seeing a large number of Degas paintings and being very influenced by them. And I think one of his great contributions in art was in that breaking the sanctity of the picture edge. And I think if we look at this painting of Comedy Riders, one of her circus paintings, she's making full use of that modern convention here. And you can see how that tendency to be able to break the surface, to deny the viewer the fulfillment of seeing an entire composition within the frame, would have really appealed to her irreverence. Finally, in this probably her most famous self-portrait of 1913, she loads the left-hand side of the composition with multiple activity of her body, a self-portrait, and then the picture that she's painting directly behind. And then after drawing the eye towards it, pushes the eye back into the centre of the picture through the direction of the face. The red foreground and the background is similar in colour, and that's quite bold, even confrontational if you like. But she's achieved a subtle depth in those two forms through the dabbed paint handling of the cardigan, which brings that element closer to the viewer. The tonality of the face and the hat sort of draws the eye, and it makes us aware of the fact that Laura Knight is not looking at the model, but she's not looking at us either. I think maybe she wanted the profile view, as it's the most sort of definitive declaration of status, like a head on a coin. You can look at me, she seems to be saying, a woman painting a nude figure, but I choose not to look at you. I think it is fair to say that much of Laura Knight's early painterly understanding of tone came from her husband Harold, and through their trips together to Holland. His early paintings from staves are, I think, some of his strongest pictures, and Laura Knight absorbed that aesthetic and adapted it to her own preferred subjects of families and children. And I think this was probably why the couple were drawn to the Newlyn School, with its influence of Stanhope Forbes, a place where modern visual language had not displaced the emotional narrative. During the Cornwall period, there was more focus on colour, but the attention to tone returns most fully in the ballet and circus pictures later on. This is where we start to see tonality drive in the composition and narrative. Firstly, she understands how tone can create regions of varying depth in a picture, pulling the eye in and out, particularly in an interior or a nocturnal scene, directing the reading of the picture. This has been a feature of picture making since the 16th century, and I just want to point out this beautiful painting by Domenico Beccafumi, and this detail, which shows how it's a language totally born out of a period that was the dawn of the oil painting process, really, or the popularisation of oil painting as the main process, and it leads into the language of the Baroque. Also an influence on the late 19th century painters was the Japanese idea that had come in with the whole culture of Japanism, the idea of notan, which is a design term describing the use of alternating areas of dark and light. We've got a figure here against the light on the left, then light against dark, and again back to dark against light. We see this tendency used by Laura Knight to activate and excite the surface, and to hint at the slight spatial disorientation that can occur when one is backstaged or dazzled by the light at a circus. This wonderfully succinct self-portrait is an example of this, quite simply. It uses the black rectangle to contrast with the light side of her face, and that provides more compositional pattern as we go across the picture, but it also makes the figure more distinct from the background. In this portrait of Ethel Bartlett, we've got again light against dark on the left hand side of the head and face, and then sort of dark against light on the other side, and it takes that sculptural form to an even more refined level with subtle rendering and a higher level of finish, but with just enough blur in the outside edge to prevent the form from flattening too much. This is one of her paintings influenced by the refinement of modelling in the work of her lifelong friend Dod Proctor, who had evolved a very sensitive approach to the subtlety of form, and sort of really was part of that interwar Art Deco style that we can see in painters like Tamara del Lempicka and Meredith Frampton. Here she combines the sculpture and modelling with alternating darks and lights around the head and legs to really give a presence to the figure. We see the world with stereoscopic vision, but a painter has to contrive that same immediacy onto a flat canvas. And all they've got is illustrative techniques such as this, careful deployment of lights against darks and darks against lights, hopefully making us feel as though we can reach around the forms and giving the forms tangibility. In this painting, she uses both tonal contrast and variation of paint handling to slow down our visual experience, drawing the eye upwards towards the face, but then slowing down our awareness of the background activity by limiting its tonal range. She's effectively directing the scene like a filmmaker would. Dame Laura Knight writes with amazing richness and clarity about her experiences living in busy inner city Nottingham. And though she seemed to thrive, describing herself as a bit of a tomboy, she mentions the liberation she felt in places like Staves and Cornwall, with so much space and light. She hadn't seen the sea until she was 9 years old, and having grown up in Birmingham, I can understand the allure of the coast, where suddenly one half of your world is opened up to the vastness of sea and space. With the route to establishing herself as a female artist being such an uphill struggle, it's not surprising that Laura Knight repeatedly uses an elevated viewpoint as a way of confirming to the viewer, and probably to herself, that she has arrived, she is here, and she is in control. The elevated viewpoint also allows the artist to be more involving and complex with the elements. Multiple vignettes occurring simultaneously across the picture, gathering more and more occurrences, people, characters, exactly the kind of thing that the socialist Laura Knight would warm to. Peter Bruegel employs the same device for similar reasons in numerous paintings back in the 16th century. In this painting of Spring, she's able to pose her friends, Ella and Charles Napier, as proud and independent characters with a burgeoning rural setting of hedgerows, sheep and blossom, and in the distance topography, clouds and a rainbow. In one painting she's managed to evoke an entire Thomas Hardy-like world. This scene in St John's Wood in London is a bit more frivolous, but it's just as novelistic. We're invited to move from one set piece to another, over the road, weaving our way through the gardens towards the city in the background. It's a picture, seems to have echoes of Stanley Spencer's worldview. Again, these two Chelsea scenes of the embankment from London studio window show a desire to capture multiple activities, and I think you get a sense of the breeze coming in off the Thames. I like the way she's put a wood truck in each of the pictures, and obviously thinking it was quite a nice motif, so why not repeat it? Just before embarking on the series of paintings as an official war artist, Laura and Harold were staying at the Mount Pleasant Hotel in Malvern, and it's here she falls back on a similar strategy, the omniscient observer as the artist depicting the scene below. It's interesting, I think, to compare that painting from 1939 with this painting of the Nuremberg war trials at the end of the war in 1946. It's no surprise to find out later in her autobiography that when she was led to the courtroom, she rejected the suggested artist spectator area, saying it was uninteresting, and when asked where she would like to go, she immediately pointed to an unused broadcast box above the dock and said, "There." So she actively chose this elevated viewpoint. Whilst full of both recognisable and anonymous individuals, all men, arranged from a striking viewpoint, the painting feels like it's an almost unavoidable compromise. She's had to allow the banality of evil emergent in the courtroom proceedings to filter upwards and to be met with the actual reality of wholesale death and destruction that the war caused from the outside. It's a picture that reminds me of this William Orpen's equivalent take on a similar kind of scene during the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Again, the artist seems sort of exasperated by the politicians he's been sent there to record, and he's just allowed his gaze to escape upwards into the architecture itself. She was enamoured by El Greco's view of Toledo which she saw in America, in New York. It's a really astonishing, forward-thinking painting from the late 16th century. It feels like it's painted in the 20th century by Soutine or someone. And it's this combination of expression and elevation that I think she's channeled in this similar view of Love Lane in Malvern. This highlights another aspect of the elevated viewpoint, how it allows Laura Knight to flirt with a sort of slight semi-abstracted picture surface without compromising her pre-modernist aesthetic. It allows her to tilt up the ground plane, often losing the horizon line, and the picture is then free to explore a kind of natural flatness. Duran often used an elevated viewpoint for the same reason, and it can suit the looser handling that you get when you're painting outdoors. I saw this picture in Birmingham Art Gallery recently, and with its lush colour and thick brushwork, it had the sort of presence of a wall hanging. It sort of flirts with that decorativeness. Finally, I want to point out possibly the most vital aspect of Dame Laura Knight's art, and that is the immense sense of empathy and compassion it conveys. Right from her earliest times as a young painter in Staves and Newlyn, she would become acquainted with working class families and children and pay them to model for her, often in their own homes. In this picture, where our view is taken by the children and they're more actively observed than the mother, we're immediately invited to share their fascination with the cat in the middle of the room. In this brilliant picture, set in Staves but painted in Cornwall, we're taken through a succession of individually shared moments. Having grown up with two sisters and suffering the early death of one of them, she was attuned to the poignancy when an older sister takes responsibility for a younger sibling. Here again, there's no idealisation or sentimentality about the scene, just children being themselves, just a straightforward depiction of a fairly uneventful moment in the sun. She depicts girls and young women at different stages of awakening and development, and they always seem to have a sense of self-awareness. They wear contemporary practical clothing, they're not sentimentalised, and they're often depicted drawing or thinking. We've seen contemplative male subjects in paintings like this by Caspar David Friedrich, but the woman as sole protagonist rather than muse in pictures had obviously been underexplored, especially by a female observer, and perhaps this ties in with the rise at the time of female writers such as Virginia Woolf or Dorothy Parker. Throughout her life, she engaged with people on the margins of society and wanted to tell their stories. She was familiar with places like Nottingham Goose Fair as a child, Penzance Fair and Epsom race meetings. At these places she would often paint the members of the travelling communities. She took all people at face value, it seems, and these informal pictures, they feel like they're more about the shared experience of live figure painting than an overly designed picture. The lowered eye level in this picture, I think, says so much about what she wants to achieve with regard to empathy. When travelling in America with Harold, she unsurprisingly responded to a racially segregated hospital by painting a number of intimate portraits of the nurses, the mothers and the children there. She was an extrovert, I think, and you could perhaps think about artists like Picasso, Sickert and Whistler as similarly outgoing artists who felt an affinity with the theatrical world. As a hard-working artisan, she seemed to appreciate the craft and ingenuity of others involved in unusual trades and recognise the sacrifices that many of them have had to make to achieve what they achieved. Finally, this painting, Storm Over Our Town, is my favourite Dame Laura Knight picture, and I think it possesses all the qualities that I've mentioned. It's a technically well-drawn, elevated scene again of the Priory in Malvern, it's an ingenious use of tone to create depth and to forefront objects and to push other elements backwards. It's a dynamic composition. It draws our attention to the struggle of individuals against the chaos of life. I think now more than ever we need art to give us stories, characters and ideas. Much of art over the last 120 years has been about style and appearance. Too often the art word, I think, has been elitist and self-referential, and it's failed more often than not to engage a broader audience with really important ideas. Just as a final footnote, Laura Knight wrote, "Skill in the arts is only a means to an end. You must have something to say for yourself, or it's no good trying."